Welcome back to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Today we're digging into one of the most iconic and complicated figures in pro wrestling history, Hulk Hogan. From sold-out arenas and Saturday morning cartoons to courtrooms and controversy, Hogan's story is bigger than wrestling. He helped build the industry into what it is today, for better or worse. Let's get started. July 28, 2025 Observer Newsletter. The Life and Times of Hulk Hogan. By Dave Meltzer. It was more than 41 years ago when the modern era of pro wrestling began, as Hulk Hogan, already the biggest drawing card in the US while working for Vern Gagne's, was with photographer Steve Taylor, who passed along a message from Vince McMahon telling him he wanted to make him the first pro wrestler to earn $1 million a year. Hogan reportedly sent Gagne a telegram that he was done. Gagne continued to advertise him for shows on his circuit for more than 6 weeks. After Hogan missed his first major date, a sold-out show on Christmas night at the St. Paul Civic Center, it was seen as strange, but guys did miss dates. The next night in Madison Square Garden, the crowd was stunned as the Iron Sheik beat Bob Backlund to win the WWF title. It all fell into place on December 27, 1983, as Hogan, Roddy Piper, Gene Akerlund, Gagne's interviewer and a close friend of Hogan's, and David Schultz, Hogan's big Iowa rival at the time, showed up in St. Louis at the Chase Hotel for a WWF television taping. The wrestling world had changed. It didn't take a mathematician to put 2 plus 2 together and see that Hogan was going to beat the Iron Sheik to win the title and a new era of pro wrestling was beginning. But even then, with the knowledge McMahon was going to try and expand the WWF nationally, with Hogan as his standard bearer, nobody could have fully comprehended what this was going to mean to the industry. The industry changed in gigantic ways. Hogan became the most famous pro wrestler who ever lived, a literal household name, as the leading soldier in the most important war in pro wrestling history. Within a few years, almost all of the existing territories were dead, and the few survivors had lost most of their popularity when fans could see the WWF product on their local television. Terry Gene Bollea, the man who was transformed by pro wrestling into being Hulk Hogan, passed away on July 24, just a few weeks before his 72nd birthday. He had been having major health issues from complications after neck surgery on May 14. While Bubba the Love Sponge for weeks had talked about him being in a coma and near death, his friends like Eric Bischoff, Jimmy Hart and wife Sky Daly had tried to downplay the situation publicly. We do know that Hogan had taken a turn for the worst over the last week and could no longer talk. He hadn't been seen publicly for some time. One person close to him over the past week had noted that, at the time, he was not quite as bad off as Bubba had been saying. It was also a lot worse than anything anyone else was saying. Another person close to the situation said that there were a number of other medical issues after the neck surgery. Bubba pretty much had legit info the whole time, said one person close to the situation, who also cited that despite what Jimmy Hart said publicly, that privately he was telling Hogan's friends and former friends that it wasn't good but to keep it quiet. Basically, what happened with Hulk was they took him out of the hospital and made a hospital in his house as there wasn't much left they could do. He had been a patient at Tampa General Hospital and had been intubated and was having renal failure and fluid overload as well as severe COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. That is a long-term lung disease that makes it difficult to breathe. It encompasses conditions like emphysema and chronic bronchitis. While smoking is the primary cause, non-smokers can also develop COPD. COPD is a leading cause of death in the United States. The Clearwater, Florida, Police Department sent a memo saying, Clearwater, Florida Fire Department and Clearwater Police Department personnel responded to a medical call at 9:51 a.m. today in the 1000 block of El Dorado Avenue on Clearwater Beach. The nature of the call was for a cardiac arrest. A 71-year-old resident, Terry Bollea, also known as Hulk Hogan, was treated by Clearwater Fire and Rescue crews before being taken by Sunstar Morton Plant Hospital where he was pronounced deceased. The legacy of Hulk Hogan will always be complicated. He carried the pro wrestling industry and changed it completely, paving the way for success for another generation. He was the right guy at the right time. He took the act he saw superstar Billy Graham and later Austin Idol use to success, through the recommendation of Terry Funk, got a part in the movie Rocky III, and he'd go to the ring in the Iowa to the song Eye of the Tiger from that movie. Hogan, as the face of the WWF during its national expansion starting in 1984 as champion, was the biggest thing in wrestling and the key to WWF becoming the top promotion in the world. The entire history of U.S. wrestling changes. It is possible McMahon could have expanded nationally and won the wrestling war either way, but the odds greatly lower without someone of Hogan's charisma in the top position. The first WrestleMania nearly bombed even with the magic of Hogan, Roddy Piper and Mr. T as the main eventers and likely could not have worked without any of the three. Would McMahon still have tried something at that level and failed? Impossible to say. But Hogan was there, and became the person who ushered in the idea of closed-circuit shows and later PPV shows. His run opened the door for everything that happened in wrestling since. His second run in WCW, where he turned heel in 1996, led to a period where WCW became the hottest pro wrestling company in the world for a few years, although they were unable to sustain that period and were out of business shortly after. He became a very legitimate cultural icon, reaching a level that only a handful of wrestlers over the course of history reached, perhaps limited to Jim Londos, Rikidozen, Antonio Inoki, Giant Baba, Dwayne Johnson, and El Santo. All but Johnson and Santo were only in pockets of the world and not the entire world. And Johnson and Santo's fame was more from being movie stars, although they were culturally big as pro wrestlers. Santos was limited to Spanish cultures while Hogan and Johnson crossed over to many different languages and cultures. But there is nobody, and it's not even close, who more people bought tickets to pro wrestling to see over the course of as long a period of time as Hulk Hogan. But it's a complicated legacy that he leaves. While many could overlook it and would overlook anything, it's hard to get past his admitting being racist in Pillow Talk with the wife of Bubba the Love Sponge. In 2007, while at the tail end of his first marriage to Linda Claridge, he asked Bubba, at the time his best friend, if he could sleep with Bubba's then wife Heather Clem, now Heather Cole. Bubba agreed to it. He then secretly filmed it. At the end of the sex, Bubba is seen talking to Heather about how their retirement was set up, since they had a tape that in theory Hogan would pay millions to keep from getting out, if they needed it. Far more damaging than having sex with his best friend's wife while his own marriage was on the rocks, were the comments he made, as his daughter, Brooke, was at the time dating a black man. During the conversation, Hogan used the N-word multiple times, said he was a racist to a point and talked about how he wasn't happy with her dating a black man but said it would be okay if it was an NBA star. Nobody knew about it. For whatever reason, Bubba had the tape in his office at work. Somebody then stole the tape from him and evidently sold it to the National Enquirer, and Gawker put the tape of him having sex on their website in 2015. Hearing what Hogan said was something that killed his reputation to many, although his status was such that he still was able to get sponsorship work. WWE washed its hands of him for years, canceling his contract with him and removing him from the Hall of Fame, something they didn't even do with Jimmy Snuka or Tammy Sytch. In 2018, the WWE decided to bring him back and had him talk to the talent. The general feeling among the talent, and certainly the ones we heard from most black and some white, was that they were terribly disappointed. The consensus was Hogan's speech was about the evils of social media and be on guard and don't get caught, rather than apologizing to the black wrestlers for openly saying he said he was a racist. After it got out, Hogan did apologize, saying, 8 years ago I used offensive language during a conversation. It was unacceptable for me to have used that offensive language, there is no excuse for it, and I apologize for having done it. The true story behind the sex tape was one of Bubba's former employees, Matt Lloyd, and a rival DJ named Mike Calta stole the DVD from Bubba's office and then tried to sell it and leak it. Bubba got fired and Calta got and still has the morning show in Tampa 102.5, said one person close to the situation. Peter Thiele, who was mad at Gawker for revealing he was gay, backed Hogan in the lawsuit. Gawker refused to settle, and claimed the tape of Hogan having sex was protected by it being a news story about a public figure. A trial ensued where Gawker reporters came off arrogant and badly and Hogan was awarded so much money that it put Gawker out of business. Bubba did try to make amends with Hulk on numerous occasions, said one friend of Bubba's who knew people on all sides. There is a very secret story between them that involves Nick that if you knew of there should have been no reason for Hulk to at least allow Bubba to personally apologize. He is on air, and make some sort of amends. After all, he did receive approximately $50 million from those sex tape lawsuits. At his last WWE appearance on the Netflix debut he was booed. He was also heavily booed at the 2021 WrestleMania where he was brought back to co-host the show with Titus O'Neil. WWE appearances of late he was booed. He was scheduled for a Saturday night's main event in January in San Antonio, but pulled out, as it legit took place on the same day as his son's wedding, but the company wasn't aware and had promoted and built the show around him. On subsequent Saturday night's main events, he was not brought back, likely because of him being heavily booed on the Jan. 6th Raw show in Inglewood, California, even though Saturday night's main event was built on the nostalgia of the 80s Saturday night's main event shows where he was virtually always the main event. Those 80s shows were some of the most watched television shows in that late Saturday night time slot in history, with ridiculous record numbers in particular among those 2 to 17. Last year, He had been in the media at the Republican convention doing his Hogan promo act, tearing his shirt off, and calling Donald Trump his hero. That audience reacted tremendously to him. He was heavily praised by both Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance at the time, and right after his death. WWE had partnered with Hogan and Chad Bronstein in his Real American Beer product, and they were also sponsoring Real American Freestyle, a wrestling promotion doing legitimate freestyle matches with some of the top amateur wrestlers in the country, including Kyle Snyder, Wyatt Hendrickson, and Kennedy Blades. This past week when they announced their Fox Nation streaming deal, while quoted in the press release, Kurt Angle did the promotional work. He became the biggest drawing card in the country during his 1981 83-hour run, and the biggest draw in the history of that organization. At the same time, his popularity exploded in New Japan Pro Wrestling, where he was making $10,000 per week, at the time astronomical compared to what pro wrestlers earned, even what he earned in the Awa. He was Awa's top star as well as one of New Japan's big three with Antonio Inoki and Andre the Giant. Bobby Heenan, who was the top heel manager during that period and later became his adversary in WWF, and an announcer who had to put him over or not depending on circumstances in WCW, once noted to me about Hogan's role in the end of the Crusher era. Crusher, he said, was the guy who laid the golden eggs for the Awa, and then Hogan came along, and he laid bigger eggs. He'll always be best remembered for his WWF role from 1984 to 1992, as the perennial world champion in red and yellow, cupping his ear as he came out to American Made. He did a routine that always worked, selling early and making the Superman comeback. It was a combination of the babyface psychology of Dusty Rhodes, the top star when he grew up as a wrestling fan going to the matches at the Fort Homer Hesterly Armory on Tuesday nights in Tampa, and of Jerry Lawler, who was the top star and later an opponent when he was in one of his early territories based in Tennessee. Long before they were ever linked together publicly, Jimmy Hart, who was starting his career as a heel manager in that territory, talked to Lawler when seeing him, thinking with his look that he could be the biggest attraction in the business. He talked with Lawler with the idea of actually managing and booking him, whether it would be outside territories or even as an Andre the Giant-like touring attraction. Lawler nixed the idea, thinking he would never be that level of a star or draw. Terry Funk first took notice of him when he heard that a match between Andre the Giant and Terry the Hulk Boulder in Dothan, Alabama, had set the all-time gate record for that city. On May 5, 1979, in an angle at the TV tapings at WTVY Studios where Boulder and Andre were to do an arm wrestling match, Boulder was losing and turned the table over and attacked Andre, leading to a match there in Pensacola, Florida, and perhaps other cities that week on the circuit. In 1980, that angle was copied on WWF television in Allentown, Pennsylvania, leading to Hogan vs. Andre matches not only in WWF, but that tape of Hogan putting a foreign object in his elbow pad, hitting Andre with a Hogan hammer, a clothesline, and then body slamming him, was playing on television in several other circuits, leading to Andre vs. Hogan matches all over the Northeast, including at Shea Stadium, as well as at the Superdome in New Orleans, the Omni in Atlanta, the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles, and Paul Suave Arena in suburban Montreal. Funk talked Jim Barnett into bringing him to Georgia, but Ole Anderson, Barnett's booker, always said he wasn't impressed and claimed he fired him. Hogan claimed the same, and told a story about quitting wrestling and working on the loading docks in Tampa until Terry Funk got him into WWF. Of course, none of that was true, as would be the case of much of what Hogan said over the years, including in his first autobiography that was largely fiction, as were most of his interviews. But he understood how to talk to people to like him, as he spoke softly, acting sincere. He understood how to be Hulk Hogan the character, to the media, and how to be sincere Hulk Hogan, with his ability to admit wrestling wasn't totally real, disarming them thinking that they were talking an honest person, since he was betraying the biggest covenant of the wrestling business. Thus they would believe his other fiction. But still, everything from the stories of him missing a phone call and he could have gotten the George Foreman grill gig, he was asked to tour with Metallica, that he used to fight in Pride when he was in Japan, and practically every story about his pro wrestling career and life was altered, so many of which have been so for so long that the fiction has become the truth, similar in many ways to Andre the Giant. In reality, the father of Vince McMahon brought Terry Bollea to television first on November 13, 1979, in Allentown, Pennsylvania. He made him a heel, the Incredible Hulk Hogan, managed by Freddie Blassie. Everyone immediately saw him as the new and young version of superstar Billy Graham, who had been the biggest heel draw in the territory before leaving a year earlier. While flying into the Northeast for television, he continued to work as Sterling Golden in Georgia, finishing up on December 3, 1979, in Augusta, Georgia, where even in his last match in the territory, He pinned mid-carder and future legend Bret Hart. McMahon supposedly envisioned him as an Irish star, where the Hogan name came from. Hogan said McMahon wanted to have him dye his hair red. It's preposterous that the look of Terry the Hulk Boulder or Sterling Golden with the physique and coming off Graham that anyone would want him to look anything but the way he did. He had a strong heel run. For reasons never really explained, he never had a 1980 title match with Backlund in Madison Square Garden, but did at other arenas. Usually in those matches, he lost via count out and not via pin. It's likely McMahon thought the biggest money wasn't with Backlund as with most heels, as with Andre. Of course he lost to Andre often with finishes where he'd collapse trying to body slam him. He got the offer to do Rocky III, when Sylvester Stallone picked to play Thunder Lips, the Ultimate Male, in a boxer versus wrestler skit that was taken from the idea of the 1976 Antonio Inoki vs. Muhammad Ali and Andre vs. Chuck Wepner matches. The Rocky character at first was based on boxer Wepner. Stallone wanted a giant pro wrestler who would dwarf him. Funk suggested Hogan, John Studd, and Gorilla Monsoon, and Stallone immediately saw Hogan as the obvious pick. I had the pleasure of meeting this brilliant personality and showman when he was 26 years old, wrote Stallone. He was absolutely wonderful and his amazing skill made Rocky III incredibly special. My heart breaks. The story was that when the elder McMahon heard, he told him he couldn't do it, and would fire him if he took the role. And Hogan did it anyway and got fired. That makes little sense because heels would cycle in and out of the territory, and Hogan was doing his losses and clearly on the way out, with the idea he'd go somewhere else and maybe in 3 to 5 years, he'd come back for another run as a headline star against whoever the top babyface champion was. Hogan worked for his last 6 weeks, losing to Dominic DeNucci and Tony Garea via DQ, WWF champion Backlund and IC champion Pedro Morales via count out, as well as Tony Atlas, in a bodybuilder versus bodybuilder feud and Andre via pins, losing in 7:08 to Atlas in his last Madison Square Garden match on March 16, 1981, and left to film the movie on April 18, 1981, after losing to Atlas again. He was booked like every heel who had put over the key faces and was leaving to go elsewhere. He did the movie filming, and a few matches on the dying Southern California circuit when filming, returned to Florida, before starting in the AWA in August. Gagne's idea at first was for him to be a heel, managed by Johnny Valiant, who would do the talking for him. Except the audience cheered like crazy for him from the start. Gagne did a television angle where heel Jerry Blackwell was destroying former Olympic wrestler Brad Rheingans after a match, and the new Hogan ran in and body slammed the 400-pound Blackwell. The angle was in August 1981. He was an immediate hit and AWA crowds were growing with Hogan's matches against Blackwell and heel cohorts Adrian Adonis and Jesse Ventura. While their in-ring matches weren't much at all, the promo chemistry for Hogan vs. Ventura was tremendous, and they built up to arm wrestling matches as well as tags and trios matches where Adonis could carry the heavy load. While many credit the Rocky movie for Hogan's success as a draw, he had already set the AWA on fire as a babyface, doing the same act he would later do in WWF, months before that movie came out on May 28, 1982. But that movie did get him a spot on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson in an era where wrestlers rarely got that level of mainstream exposure. Only the great Antonio as a strongman comedy freak and Lou Thesz had been on that show previously. In those days, Hogan came out to Eye of the Tiger, the theme song from Rocky III. Attendance was far ahead of the early 70s glory period built around Crusher, superstar Billy Graham, Nick Bockwinkel and Ray Stevens as a tag team, Gagne, Billy Robinson, Ivan Koloff, Wahoo McDaniel, and others who had become iconic cultural figures in cities like Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago, Milwaukee, Winnipeg, Denver, and throughout the Midwest. Terry Bollea grew up in Tampa, and was always a large kid, being much bigger than everyone else on his Little League All-Star team in 1965. But he played no sports after that. He went to Robinson High School in Tampa. He was 2 years younger than Mike Gossett, Mike Graham, Steve Kieran and Dick Slater, who all went to the school and became pro wrestling stars. Billy Graham remembered him as the tall kid in the second row at the matches in Tampa. Hogan idolized Billy Graham and Dusty Rhodes at the time and met Graham. Hogan told Graham when they met he wanted to be just like him. Graham's stories changed at different points, but for sure Hogan asked Graham about using steroids at this point in time. Graham at one point said he didn't tell him what to do, at other points said that he did. Hogan didn't know about cycling and went from 220 to 320 pounds. He went to the University of South Florida, but dropped out of college to play with local bands. He was playing in a band called Ruckus in 1976 when Jack and Jerry Briscoe were at the bar he was performing at. He talked with them, said he was a big fan and wanted to be a wrestler. They saw his size and look with the blonde hair, and sent him to train at the Sportatorium in Tampa with Hiro Matsuda. Hogan always told the story that they wanted to run him off and that Matsuda, on purpose, on the first day, broke his ankle to make him quit. The story was told so many times that even people who knew enough not to believe Hogan's stories accepted that one as fact. And the fact was, if someone came and wanted to be a pro wrestler, Matsuda, or other shooters would injure them on purpose, as did other trainers and promoters in that era, with the idea of protecting the business from outsiders. But Hogan came through the recommendation of Jack Briscoe, a stockholder in Georgia and likely Florida, and thus he was not an outsider. The idea was that they wanted to injure outsiders and make them quit. And that was the case if you were a guy off the street wanting to be a pro wrestler. Brian Blair, who trained with Hogan, started their careers together and remained friends with him for the rest of his life, told us that the actual story is Terry sprained his ankle and missed a few classes, but that it was not something Matsuda did intentionally but just an injury from training. There are video clips of Hogan in class that showed him as a tall, almost skinny person, far lighter than people remember him. The first recorded match for Hogan was on August 9, 1977, a few days before his 24th birthday where, under a mask as Super Destroyer, he lost to very small prelim wrestler Don Serrano in Fort Pierce, Florida. The next night, as Terry Bollea, he went to a 10 o'clock draw with Blair and he was on his way. While Super Green, the size alone was enough that they could see potential, so they kept him under a mask until leaving the territory in October. Bob Geigel wanted to bring him into Kansas City but he decided against it, and managed a club with friend Whitey Bridges in Cocoa Beach, FL, and opened a gym. He was friends with Ed Leslie, the future Brutus Beefcake, and talked about going back to wrestling as a brother tag team. He called Billy Graham for help in finding a place to go. Graham called Louis Tillett the booker in the Gulf Coast territory and he returned to the ring. During this period both David Schultz and Randy Cully told Irv Muchnick that he was also a drug connection for them. Leslie, before becoming Brutus Beefcake, would work as Hogan's brother, using he named Dizzy Hogan, Eddie Hogan, and Eddie Boulder. Hogan first used the name Terry the Hulk Boulder when working for Tillett in March 1979. The story of him being on a talk show and being bigger than Lou Ferrigno, and the host going "You're the real Hulk" was totally made up, but it's been repeated so often people have accepted it as true. By May, Jerry Jarrett heard about him and did a video in his backyard that was one of things he did well in introducing new talent. The video showed Hogan posing with the narrator saying, "What you see is not an illusion," and citing he was 6'9", 320 or so pounds, running down fake measurements including 24-inch arms. He started as a babyface partner for Lawler in matches against the Mongolian Stomper and Gorgeous George Jr. He worked a few big shows for Jarrett, who was still based in the Gulf Coast, where he beat Ox Baker on June 6, 1979, in Mobile to win the Southeastern Championship. He dropped it to one of the people he would copy, Austin Idol, 1 week later. During this period both David Schultz and Randy Cully told Irv Muchnick that he was also a drug connection for them, steroids and otherwise. This is believed, but never officially known, would play a part 15 years later in the Vince McMahon steroid trial. Idol was one of the many Graham copies, and used the phrase Idolmania for his fans and would always use the term Jack, which Hogan used until later changing that to brother. On June 22, he wrestled Harley Race in Dothan, Alabama for his first NWA title shot, winning via DQ. In July, there was an angle on Memphis TV where heels Ron Bass and Pete Austin beat down A. Boulder, who did a promo saying he was calling his big brother, the Hulk, to help him. They did a tag team feud which ended up with Terry challenging Bass many times for the Southern title. He was full-time in the Jarrett territory through early September, when Terry Funk hooked him up with Barnett, who used him as Sterling Golden for a few months until his WWF debut. While he used to refer to Leslie as his friend till the end, the two had a falling out and hadn't talked in years. When Leslie was going to write an autobiography, he threatened to sue Leslie for fear of what he might say. "Through the good times and the bad, I always loved my brother Terry," wrote Leslie. "I am devastated by the loss of my friend. I only wish we had time to mend our broken friendship before his passing. Until I see you, brother, in the big squared circle in the sky. I love you." It was through his success in WWF that he was booked to New Japan for a first tour in May 1980, with Blassie as manager. Blassie was a legendary figure in Japan, one of the most famous and remembered Americans of all time for his biting in the early 60s and matches with Rikidozen and other big names. He had a great look to be a main eventer in Japan, and the Blassie rub made him a big star from the day he stepped off the plane at Narita Airport and Blassie started talking to the media about him. He, Andre, and Stan Hansen were immediately the big three foreigners in New Japan, and when Hansen left, it was he and Andre. In 1980, Inoki and Backlund beat Hansen and Hogan to win the end-of-the-year tag team tournament when Inoki pinned Hogan. But after starting in the Iowa in late 1981, and with Hansen leaving for All Japan, Hogan did no jobs anywhere. In St. Louis, the traditional February 3rd fall world title matches ended when Hogan wouldn't lose a fall to race as champion by pin, and they could only do a one-fall match with a DQ finish. Japan was the place in wrestling in that era, and the top stars at the time, Andre, Hogan, Hansen, and Bruiser Brody, to protect their position and because Japanese magazines would cover their US bouts, couldn't lose by pinfall in the US or anywhere. After Rocky III came out, promoters in South Africa wanted the giant blonde guy who did the boxer versus wrestler skit with Sylvester Stallone. They couldn't contact Hogan, but did make a connection to Terry Funk, and offered $70,000 to Hogan for a match with Funk. At the time, New Japan and All Japan were in bitter feud. The Funks were All Japan bookers, and Terry very literally hated Inoki as his enemy because of his closeness with Baba. But he was always friendly with Hogan and Hansen, and secretly negotiated the tremendous contract for Hansen to switch to All Japan at the end of 1981. Hogan and Funk wrestled in Cape Town, South Africa. Because of each's standing, in theory, they would have to have done a disqualification or count-out finish. To this day, I'm not sure if Hogan won via DQ or via pin. But I do know that both agreed to keep the fact they wrestled each other quiet, let alone talk about who won. Hogan came back to Japan after the tour, and the first thing he did was brag to reporters how he beat Terry Funk in South Africa. It's hard to understand the magnitude of that today, given Funk's stature at the time in All Japan. When Funk heard about this from the reporters, he went to the Kao Plaza Hotel, where Hogan was staying. He found the room number, and with some of the biggest wrestling reporters by his side, started pounding on the hotel room door and screaming for Hogan to answer it. Funk was mad enough to fight him. The seriousness of protecting not so much his business but the All Japan business in his mind meant he had to fight him. Funk was 39 and Hogan was 10 years younger and a whole lot bigger. Funk was also a college football star, a legit athlete. WH was trained to wrestle and fight by his father, and did police work for the Amarillo promotion, which required beating up and hurting people who said they wanted to be pro wrestlers. He had seen his father at dinner in a restaurant. When someone would come up and make a remark that wrestling was fake, have his father lash out at the person and beat them up badly. So that was the life and world he was brought up in. Hogan never answered the door. Funk pounded on it for a while, and eventually left. Years later, Funk would joke with me about that night, saying who knows what would have happened had he opened the door. He said he absolutely would have started swinging because he was in a position that he had to. But he joked, who knows what would have happened. Maybe he'd have thrown me out the window, and eventually reconciled. He was glad that Hogan never opened the door. A few years later, when Funk joined the WWF, he had a Saturday night's main event match with Hogan for the title in Tampa. He joked at the time that a few people were asked and balked at the idea of doing a job in front of such a large television audience. He felt it was just a chance to get over to such a large audience and put on a show. Hogan beat him. It drew one of the biggest audiences ever to see a pro wrestling show on US television. Most considered it a great match. But from a business standpoint, Hogan had pinned him in front of so many people, so it made no sense to do a big house show run, where Funk could have made the most money in his career. Hogan never lost a fall in the Iowa or anywhere else. After his last singles loss to Inoki, Hogan never lost a fall from 1982 to the 1988 gimmick finish with Andre, and a real clean fall until the 1990 match with Ultimate Warrior. Another of the great Hogan myths in that era regarded the Iowa title. Hogan was clearly the top babyface. Nick Bockwinkel was the heel world champion. They were usually kept apart so that there would be two different major matches, Hogan match against the big talking heels like Blackwell, Ventura and strongman Ken Patera, and Bockwinkel against other babyfaces. On occasion, they'd book title matches where Hogan would win via DQ. Hogan was essentially booked like Crusher during the heyday, although Crusher would on rare occasion lose falls to set up a bigger match. Hogan couldn't do that because of his New Japan stature. There was likely talk of Hogan getting the title, but there were problems. The Iowa title was regularly featured in All Japan, the rival of New Japan. It was suggested Hogan switch sides and at that point could have gotten the title. He didn't want to switch sides, and New Japan paid better than the Iowa and was his priority. So his winning the title was out. Many people for decades would claim that Hogan left because Vern Gagne was so out of touch to not give him the world title because he wasn't a real wrestler. Hogan would claim Gagne was selling Hogan merchandise, and he wasn't getting a cut, which may have been true. But Hogan was leaving when Vince McMahon told him he'd become the first pro wrestler to make $1 million a year and would immediately get the WWF title. If he was AWA champion, he'd have left, and very clearly, would have never dropped the title on his way out, given that when he left, he didn't work out any notice or agree to appear in all the shows he had been advertised for after he made the decision in December to leave. At least when Hogan left, Gagne didn't lose his world champion and still had Bockwinkel and the title credibility, which would have been an even bigger blow than just losing Hogan. Plus the formula of the Hogan grudge match on top in the Bockwinkel world title match was working. When the AWA really started hitting its strides in the late 60s, Crusher was the draw, booked similar to Hogan. Gagne never gave Crusher the world title, wanting it on himself or Bockwinkel, the guys who could deliver the classic world title match, and business was great. Even when Dennis Hilgart, the Milwaukee promoter, promised Gagne that things were so big in that city that if he booked Milwaukee County Stadium and did Gagne versus Crusher for the title, he promised him he'd break the O'Connor versus Rogers record. Gagne didn't want to lose to a babyface like Crusher, and nixed the stadium show. And sure, some of that was the Gagne ego. Still, had Hogan agreed to move from New Japan to All Japan, Gagne was going to make him champion. In the long run it didn't matter. Hogan would have left. The AWA would have fallen. But the AWA did have a strong year in 1984 without Hogan and having to stave off Hogan and McMahon in all his key cities, although in the long run it was a fight Gagne was destined to lose. But if Hogan was champion and left, the nature of the business then, Gagne would not have been able to do well in 1984 when the real AWA world champion held the WWF title and was defending it on WWF shows. Clearly McMahon's idea in a perfect world would have been for Hogan to be champion, and then he'd get Hogan without dropping the title, and get NWA champion race, to also lose to Hogan, while Hogan would also win the WWF title and he'd unify the big three belts. The AWA and NWA would create new champions, but everyone would know the real champion and unified champion was Hogan. But Hogan never got the AWA title and Race turned McMahon down when McMahon tried to get him to no-show the 1983 Starrcade, where he would lose the title to Flair. Flair was taken care of so well by Jim Crockett that he wasn't coming in. There was a story at one point where Gagne, who was probably 56 but was a two-time NCAA champion wrestler, in his office, challenged the big bodybuilder who was probably 28 or 29, to something in his office. Generally the story is that Gagne shot for a takedown, Hogan, who had to have outweighed Gagne by 90 to 100 pounds, sprawled and put him in a front facelock, or a guillotine. Gagne couldn't get up with Hogan's weight on him in one version. The Hogan version is he choked Gagne out and Gagne looked like Bozo the Clown, his hair messed up everywhere. Hogan wasn't in the 1981 New Japan Tag Team Tournament, but by 1982, he was a babyface attraction teaming with Inoki. Inoki and Hogan beat Killer Khan and Tiger Taguchi, also known as Kim Duke and Tiger Chung Lee, to win the 1982 tournament, losing no matches via pin. In 1983, Andre the Giant and Swede Hansen, not Stan Hansen as is often claimed in some records, as Stan was already in All Japan, were the top point getters, but Hansen was injured and Inoki and Hogan beat Adonis and Dick Murdoch. It was while he was in Japan for this tournament that Hogan agreed to join WWF after his late 1983 marriage to Linda Claridge of Los Angeles, and proposed to after flying her to a show at the Cow Palace in San Francisco, when she feared he was flying her in to break up with her. While in Japan for that tournament, he sent Gagne a telegram that he wasn't coming back even with Gagne's huge Christmas week shows with him as the top star that were all expected to, and did, draw big crowds, including a sellout of 18,000 on Christmas night at the St. Paul Civic Center. Gagne not only continued to advertise him, but advertised Hogan in most of his cities through the end of January, even in some cities after Hogan had beaten Sheik for the WWF title. Earlier in 1983, Hogan in New Japan won one of the biggest tournaments in history. Inoki had vacated and deactivated the NWF title, which New Japan had used as its top title. For years in New Japan they claimed that tournaments were being held all over the world, and the winners of these tournaments, which were all fictitious, would convene to create the real world champion for the entire world, called the IWGP Championship. From May 6 to June 2, 1983, was that tournament, with Hogan, Inoki of course, Andre, John Studd, Khan, Rusher Kimura, Akira Maeda, Mexican Star Connect, the perennial UWA champion in Mexico although not champion at that time as Tatsumi Fujinami was champion, Otto Wanz, CWA world champion in Europe, and Enrique Vera, another top Mexican heavyweight. Hogan beat everyone except doing double countouts with Inoki and Andre. Hogan and Inoki tied for first place and everyone figured Inoki would win. Inoki lost the famous match when, in one of the most memorable scenes in Japanese history, he gave Inoki a running clothesline, the Axe Bomber, his Japanese finisher, and Inoki fell off the apron. The idea was for the story to be that Inoki went into convulsions, swallowed his tongue and that he nearly died. Inoki was motionless on the floor. Everyone panicked, because Inoki had clued nobody in on this. It's not clear if even Hogan was told ahead of time, but none of the Japanese wrestlers nor the officers of the company knew. The look on Hogan's face after what was the biggest win of his career up to that point in time was of someone who was afraid he badly injured his boss and was very scared. Not of a guy who had won the world championship in what at that time was the most lucrative and largest wrestling company in the world. Inoki kayfabed everyone. The event got so much press with the idea that Inoki nearly died, and in time when mainstream press found out it was all an angle as Inoki had a real health issue that caused him to take time off, that outside of the tabloid sports newspapers that relied on wrestling for their circulation. And the wrestling magazines, real mainstream outlets stopped covering pro wrestling. The IWGP title wasn't a title regularly defended for a few more years, but an annual tournament, like today's G1. When Hogan won the WWF title, he was in Japan billed as both IWGP and WWF champion. In 1984, Inoki won the tournament to get the shot at Hogan. The finish saw Ricky Choshu give the Ricky Lariat to both Inoki and Hogan outside the ring, and Inoki beat the 20 count and Hogan didn't, which was the only finish they could do since there's no way Vince McMahon would allow anything else. But the fans were unhappy that such a big match was spoiled by interference and rioted. After Hogan's WWF debut in St. Louis and Sheik beat Backlund, an angle was shot where the three Samoans, Afa, Sika, and Samu were beating Backlund and Hogan made the save. While Backlund was promised a rematch if he lost to Vince McMahon Sr., Vince McMahon Jr. overruled his father and had Hogan get the match on January 23, 1984, beating Iron Sheik with a leg drop, and the run started. He got so big that a settlement had to be reached with Marvel, which owned the Incredible Hulk name. Hogan had always been not just Hulk Hogan, but the Incredible Hulk Hogan. The complicated settlement gave WWF the right to use the name Hulk Hogan, the Hulkster and Hulkamania for 20 years, but not the Incredible Hulk Hogan. Now could he be billed as the Hulk, only Hulk Hogan. He'd not wear purple or green. Marvel would get a cut of all his merchandise, $100 per match if wrestled, and 10% of all other earnings. The next 2 years changed the business. WWF expanded and Hogan was the face of the company. WWF drew well at first in most places. But in some markets like Tennessee, the Carolinas, Texas, and Mid-South, they did not draw well as fans still embraced their local wrestling product. But in time those territories lost popularity. An MTV special from Madison Square Garden in 1985 where Hogan wrestled Piper, and Mr. T and Cyndi Lauper got involved, created the first WrestleMania on March 3, 1985. Even though indoors in Madison Square Garden it did $502,000 with a sellout of 20,000 fans, just slightly below the $541,730 that the 1980 Sammartino vs. Larry Zbyszko cage match at Shea Stadium, where Hogan vs. Andre was on the undercard did. But it also did 400,000 viewers on closed circuit in 133 locations around North America. For a comparison, the 1983 Starrcade, the first major closed-circuit show but in a regional area with Flair beating Race, did 30,000 in 17 locations on closed circuit. Hogan and Mr. T beat Piper and Paul Orndorff and WW is off to the races. Saturday night's main event specials on NBC followed, drawing some of the largest ratings in television history in the 11:30 p.m. Saturday night time slot. He was on the cover of Sports Illustrated when it would be unheard of for a pro wrestler to be on. The WrestleManias and then Survivor Series, SummerSlams and Royal Rumbles followed. He was always the real main event on every show he was on, whether it be PPV or arena shows, from that period through the 1992 WrestleMania. He perfected the routine, coming out to Real American by Rick Derringer. He would point his finger at the crowd, get in the ring, cup his ear to build up the crowd, and rip off his tight t-shirt. He would do a match, sometimes ending with a DQ or count out if he was in a major program, to build a rematch, but mostly ending with a Superman comeback, finger point, big boot and leg drop, followed by a post-match posing routine where the crowd was usually louder than the match itself. I don't want to say the reaction to Hogan, which I would call deafening, was the loudest ever in pro wrestling, but if you have that conversation, he's absolutely in it. He ran the gamut of the superhero that fans could count on to beat all the different form of heels, from foreign menaces to super talkers and even super workers. Then, as he got a little older, he became the sympathetic figure who the new stars could never outshine. He became a heel, who drew and carried a brand, but was so cool he killed off most of the baby faces and in the long run left the last vestiges of what started as Jim Crockett Promotions in the 1930s nay World Championship Wrestling in ruins, just less than 2 years after an incredible peak. Then he spent years coming in and out, understanding the role of a nostalgia act. In 1986, he wrestled Paul Orndorff in Toronto's Exhibition Stadium before just over 64,000 fans with 61,000 plus paid. That easily broke the North American record, whether it was held by Dano O'Mahony versus Ed Don George in Boston, Buddy Rogers versus Pat O'Connor in Chicago, or Medico Asesino in Mexico. It is still to this day the largest crowd for a pro wrestling event ever promoted in a single market, as opposed to a nationally promoted event. People always ask what my father thought of Hulk Hogan, wrote Travis Orndorff. Here is your answer. It is not our responsibility to absolve. It is our responsibility to love and forgive. The Andre the Giant feud came in 1987. Andre had always been a babyface in North America, but he was super successful as the ultimate monster heel in Japan. He was billed at 7'4", although he was probably just under 6'10" by that time, as Hogan was 6'5" for real and Andre looked 4 to 5 inches max taller than he did. Fans and media knew nothing of wrestling history, and WWF said things they couldn't have gotten away with today. They said the two had never wrestled, even though they had worked all over the country in 1979 and 1980, and had multiple matches in Japan. They went with the idea that the WWF fans who had seen them in the 1980 feud, including matches in every major arena and Shea Stadium, were mostly gone and replaced by post-1984 fans who knew no history. They claimed Andre had never lost, and never been slammed. Hogan beat Andre with a body slam and leg drop on March 29, 1987, at the Pontiac Silverdome. The 93,173 fan number became iconic, and even though those in WWE have admitted for decades the real number was 78,000, people refused to let the number go. But it broke the Toronto record, and while the 1992 SummerSlam at Wembley Stadium with Bret Hart versus Davey Boy Smith did 79,127, beating that record, WWF would never claim that because the myth of Hogan versus Andre was too important to keep. The show did 450,000, paying $5.2 million for closed circuit, a record that will never be broken, and more than 400,000 buys on PPV, which was still primitive and only available in 5 million US homes. While Hogan claimed much bigger numbers later, Jim Barnett, who wrote the actual checks, said that Hogan made $750,000 for the match, an unheard of number in that day and age. Others who later did payoffs said that until the modern era, likely the 2001 Rock vs. Hogan match, since that show grossed so much more, that with the exception of Mike Tyson in 1998, that nobody ever until that point got another $750,000 one-night payoff. However, Barnett said that Vince McMahon did pay Andre another $250,000 as a tip, both for him doing the slam and the job, and also because he knew Andre's time in the ring was running short. Hogan from 1984 to 1992 had the best drawing run in pro wrestling history. He became a pop culture icon. While WWE history would claim it was the Andre match, his mainstream breakthrough was really in 1985 prior to the first WrestleMania. Mr. T was the most popular television star in the country and was a big reason for the success of the first WrestleMania, but in the building, it was very clear the biggest reactions were for Hogan. Because of Mr. T, Muhammad Ali, Billy Martin, Liberace, and other celebrities, the show got more publicity mainstream than perhaps any wrestling show in history, even more than Hogan vs. Andre, perhaps until recent years with a totally different media landscape. The rematch on NBC, where Hogan's 4-year title run ended with the twin Hebner referee finish and Hill Hebner counting 3 even though Hogan kicked out, did $28 million for the match and $26 million for the TV show, even though that's also always listed at $33 million. Aside from Andre, the most memorable Hogan feud would have been with Randy Savage, after the Mega Powers exploded on NBC over Elizabeth. It was a legendary one-year storyline build leading to the 1989 WrestleMania. In 1988, when Hogan lost to Andre, the title was vacated. Hogan couldn't win it back as he had movie work. So in the WrestleMania tournament, built around Hogan vs. Andre as the big match, they were both disqualified. Savage, as a face, beat Ted DiBiase to win the title. Savage was a great draw as champion, but still not the level of Hogan. But that was a great business period because they could have Savage in one city defending the title and Hogan in another, both drawing big houses. Savage and that format was working so well, but I thought at the time they should have had Savage retain for more months to a year, but Vince McMahon went to Hogan at the 1989 WrestleMania, which did 767,000 buys on PPV, a record that held up until the Steve Austin boom period in 1999. As 1989 kept going, it was a unique situation. McMahon felt that Hogan, at 36, was going to run out of steam as the top attraction. At first they thought Tom McGee was the perfect candidate after a match he had with Bret Hart, but it was clear that the guy never had another match where he looked like he could be the guy, or even anything past a prelim guy. Jim Hellwig, the Ultimate Warrior, 6 years younger and even more muscular than Hogan, had burst on the scene and gotten over. He did so well that McMahon booked Hellwig to win house show main events over Andre in 30 seconds. He clearly had surpassed both Andre and Savage as the number 2 star in the company. McMahon did the first babyface versus babyface main event with Hogan vs. Warrior in 1990 at the Sky Dome in Toronto. In the months leading to the match, whenever they pushed it at the arenas, the crowd cheered Warrior's name and booed Hogan's name. This made the company feel that putting the title on Warrior was the best move, plus, again, Hogan was taking some time off. But the match was in Toronto, a city that took to Hogan more than any other. On the night of the show, Hogan was cheered and stole the show. Warrior won, but Hogan stole the scene after. And the reality was, Warrior couldn't draw like Hogan, particularly because he had weak heel challengers at the time. But it only took a few months before they contacted Sergeant Slaughter to return as a heel backed by Middle East terrorists, and he beat Warrior for the title at the Royal Rumble to set up Hogan beating Slaughter in a very controversial WrestleMania. When a war with Iraq broke out just as the Angle got going, the Angle treaded on or perhaps crossed the of being tasteless. Hogan tried to use the war, even visiting military bases, which when I reported in the National they would use the footage on television in match promotion. WWF told Frank Deford they would never do such a thing. And of course, shortly after saying that, they of course did. The 1991 WrestleMania is now seemingly most famous for being moved indoors, with the claim of a bomb threat. In 1990, McMahon made the call that he would break the so-called 93,000 record and put on a show at the Memorial Coliseum in Los Angeles, and promoted the idea of 100,000 fans in attendance. Hogan vs. Slaughter, with the idea of Slaughter turning his back on America, would be the attraction after the decision was made not to go with Hogan vs. Warrior. But with 6 weeks to go and only 14,000 tickets sold, it was moved to the Los Angeles Sports Arena, publicly claiming there were security concerns because we were in a war and it was too dangerous to run outdoors. For some reason, those security concerns didn't stop the NFL playoff games or outdoor concerts during that time frame. Hogan was the key main eventer, whether he went on last or not, at every WrestleMania from 1985 to 1993, ending with his title win over Yokozuna. In 1994, during the Vince McMahon trial, Hogan's publicist there the day before Hogan was to testify, noted how scared he was and they were. It's well known that Hogan turned state's evidence and was granted immunity in exchange for testifying against McMahon in the trial, although when on the stand he did no such thing, and may have been one of the keys in the case against McMahon falling apart. The belief was that he would testify that McMahon supplied him steroids, which would be linked to a show at the Nassau Coliseum, within the jurisdiction of the Southern District, where the trial took place. The publicist noted to me that they were scared that this would be the end for Hogan, even though he had just signed a deal with WCW and that company was going to be built around him. I noted that him testifying that he lied on Arsenio Hall and had been taking steroids since 1977, which was a lock that it would come out, was not going to damage him to wrestling fans. Most already knew that. She noted that they realized the damage of him admitting usage of steroids wasn't going to hurt, but she feared that in cross-examination, WW would attempt to ruin his character and credibility, or that somehow it would come out that he was a drug dealer, whether that was from his early days in the Gulf Coast or perhaps something else that gave the government leverage on him, where he took the immunity in exchange for testifying against Vince. The immunity was signed, and you should have seen the prosecutors' faces when Hogan testified that he was never supplied drugs by McMahon, or were drugs sent from McMahon to him. He explained that Dr. George Zaharian would send steroids for both he and McMahon to McMahon's office in Stamford, Connecticut, and the two would then split up the drugs in the package. Laura Bravetti, the attorney for Linda McMahon in the current Ring Boys trial, came out with giant binders of information on Hogan to ruin his credibility in cross-examination. But when Hogan testified for Vince, she never used any of it. It appeared the content of what they knew is what scared Hogan's publicist, and the real damage never came out in the trial. Jerry McDevitt, the other attorney in that case, excused himself from the proceedings regarding Hogan because he had represented Hogan in the past. McDevitt had saved Hogan in 1991, when he was subpoenaed by the government in the case against Dr. George T. Zaharian, a urologist in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, who would also supply drugs to WWE talent both on location and through FedEx packages. Hogan, along with other major stars like Piper, Blair, Billy Graham and Rick Martel, were to testify in the trial. However, McDevitt convinced the judge to quash Hogan's subpoena, with the argument that there were enough witnesses who would testify to what Hogan would testify to and that it would subject Hogan to ridicule and professional harm in a case that didn't need his testimony. He also cited that Zarian had treated Hogan for a medical situation that would have been embarrassing to him had it come out. The judge's ruling was widely criticized at the time. But Hogan not testifying led to mainstream attention on the trial almost disappearing, and that's an example of just how big a name he was, even compared to Piper. Hogan did testify in the McMahon case that he lied on Arsenio Hall in 1991, when he said after Zarian's lawyer publicly said in trial that Hogan and McMahon were two of Zarian's clients, that he had only used steroids 3 times in his life, all for rehabilitation of injuries. In the trial he said he used steroids from 1977 through 1989, or longer, and that while media reports said he ended using them in 1989. In testimony, he never said 1989 was when he stopped, and did concede that one of the biggest fights he ever had with wife Linda was when she found out he had lied to her and was still using steroids after he promised her he was stopping. Linda always claimed he never stopped and was always using them, even long after his in-ring career ended. Problems with McMahon started around that time. McMahon, from all accounts, told him to tell the truth, or at least admit to regular usage. McMahon at the same time in a press conference admitted usage of steroids, but also didn't tell the truth, claiming he started using them in his early 40s, very briefly, and got them from Zarian. He said he stopped very quickly because he didn't feel natural on them. McMahon claimed at one point that it was Hogan who convinced him to start using them. Testimony from his secretary Emily Feinberg in the trial showed longer regular usage as she had a notebook noting days, what was packed, and that the steroids were kept in a place in his office. The Hall interview led to a number of wrestlers who knew Hogan said his story was ridiculous. Graham and Schultz claimed to have personally injected him. Schultz's story was never disputed, but McMahon, on Phil Donahue, when saying he'd personally injected Hogan. McMahon said that Graham was a liar and that Graham had never done that. Later Graham admitted that some of the things he said on that show were not true. The Graham-Hogan issues started on the Hall show. At first, after the Zarian trial, Graham in media interviews was asked about Hogan and portrayed them as good friends. On the Hall show, Hall noted that Bruno Sammartino had criticized Hogan heavily for using steroids, and Hogan said that Sammartino was a hypocrite because he made money wrestling against a drug user, superstar Billy Graham. McMahon also told me, although he later denied it, that he was devastated when Hogan went on the show and didn't tell the truth, saying that he was of the understanding that he would. Hogan later said that McMahon had told him that day to tell the truth, but he made the decision not to, a decision he always claimed was one of his biggest regrets. Graham, who loved the limelight, was furious at the portrayal and came out strongly against Hogan lying on the show, and other wrestlers from the 80s joined him. It was a dark period for Hogan. In the arenas, he was still mostly cheered. There were negative signs and some boos, but they were drowned out. While this was going on, he started a program with Ric Flair, the dream program of the longtime NWA champion versus longtime WWF champion, which did well in its early months before tailing off because rematches in the same market saw crowds decline. McMahon then switched the main events to Hogan and Piper versus Flair and Sid Justice, and crowds popped back up. Hogan was still drawing back in 1992, but the negative publicity was so hard on him that he wanted time off after the 1992 WrestleMania. When he came back, things were different. He could still draw, but his magical drawing power was over. He won back the WWF title from Yokozuna immediately after Yokozuna had beaten Bret Hart for it. The idea was to build to SummerSlam, where Hart was told by McMahon that he'd beat Hogan for the title. Photos were shot to promote the match. Hogan didn't want to lose to Hart, feeling he wasn't big enough. They had a showdown, with Hogan and Hart going to McMahon, and McMahon obviously had not told Hogan yet that he was to lose to Hart. When Hogan, in front of Hart, asked McMahon what this was about, McMahon sided with Hogan, saying that's what Bret thought he heard but claimed Hart misheard it. However, business was way down and Hogan was always a believer to take time off when business was down, and then return, and his return would spark business. It was a strategy he used well into the 2000s in WWF. His first time back would always spark business, but by that point he was a nostalgia act and it wouldn't last. Once it was clear his impact was waning, he'd leave, which left stories with him unfinished. So of course business would go down, and then he'd be called after some time and the nostalgia would kick in. Hogan had largely left wrestling, other than working some New Japan shows for $150,000 a shot. He was working there in 1993, where he did an interview on television when he was wanting to win the IWGP Championship, and basically said the WWF title was nothing compared to the IWGP title. Of course, when asked by WWF officials, he said he never said such a thing, even though he said so on the New Japan television show. He was working on a television vehicle, Thunder in Paradise, when Eric Bischoff went through Flair to have a meeting to talk Hogan into returning to wrestling. Bischoff offered Hogan a contract where he would make far more than he never made in WWF with huge cuts of PPV, house shows and merchandise. Many thought the deal was insane, but for several years, he more than paid for himself. PPV in particular turned around instantly. Then after the 1996 heel turn in the NWO, WCW was the #1 company in wrestling from 1996 until WWF got hot under Steve Austin versus Vince McMahon and went back on top in 1998. As Hollywood Hogan of the NWO with Kevin Nash, Scott Hall and a cast of characters that got far too large, WCW and the Monday Nitro show changed wrestling. They brought in more hard-edged storylines and made Monday Night Wrestling into a party. Hogan was a heel, but the NWO was mostly cheered and it was hell on most of the babyface, who came off as patsies. It also in a sense damaged the WCW name, because the uncool guys were always being upstaged by Hogan and the NWO. But the concept worked for a few years. At one point in early 1998, WCW sold out more than 20 house shows in a row. The Hogan vs. Sting match in 1997 did more than 600,000 buys on PPV. Hogan teamed with Dennis Rodman, and faced people like Karl Malone and Jay Leno, garnering major mainstream attention. But in 1998, Steve Austin became the big thing, and suddenly Hogan was old and uncool. Hogan knew to get out, claiming he was taking time off to run for president, given longtime rival Jesse Ventura had become governor of Minnesota. Hogan and Ventura had a major feud in the Iowa, and probably would have in the WWF, but Ventura had health issues which led to the end of his in-ring career just as the WWF program was about to take off. More importantly in hindsight, when Ventura was trying to get the WWF wrestlers to unionize, basically threaten a walkout before the second WrestleMania, Hogan told Vince McMahon about it. With that word, McMahon knew enough to threaten to fire everyone involved, and the union idea died. When Ventura later sued WWF and deposed McMahon, he asked him who told him and McMahon said Hogan. For years Hogan denied the story, until recent years when on the Mr. McMahon documentary, he did admit to it. Hogan was WCW champion 6 times from 1994 to 1999. He was always out for Hogan and never for WCW. However, from 1994 through probably much of 1997, what was best for Hogan was also best for WCW. That changed with Starrcade 1997, when Sting, after a year-plus build, was to win the WCW title from Hogan at Starrcade. The story has been told in different ways at different times by all participants, but at the time, the idea was for Hogan to get a fast count pin on Sting, who would kick out at what should have been a 2 count. Bret Hart, who WCW had just signed, would complain. The match would be restarted when he'd point out the fast count, and Sting would win the title. Hogan told referee Nick Patrick not to count fast. To Patrick, it was Hogan, not Bischoff, or anyone else, who he saw as having the most power. So he didn't count fast. The match itself should have been Sting out like fire, then selling some, getting screwed, if that was even to happen before the restart and comeback title win. Instead it was a mess. Sting was at his career hot point and he was never the same after in WCW. In 1988, when Bill Goldberg got hot, the July 6, 1998 Nitro at the Georgia Dome was on fire, having sold 25,000 tickets about 2 weeks in advance. Zane Bresloff, the promoter, who was tight with Hogan dating back to their WWF days together, mentioned the advance to Hogan and the wheels got ticking. Because it was in Atlanta, many of the top executives at Turner were going to be there. Hogan first came up with the idea that with the top Turner execs there, he'd look great if he had a match. His original idea was to do a non-title dark match with Goldberg and lose it, because he knew full well this wasn't the time to end the streak and Goldberg was on fire. So Bresloff started promoting that and tickets started moving even faster. That's when he got the idea to put the match on television, and lose the title to Goldberg. That was one of the most memorable moments, with Goldberg beating Hogan clean with a spear and jackhammer to win the WCW title before a paid attendance of 36,506 and a total attendance of 41,412 and a gate of $906,330. The paid and total were the highest numbers in WCW history. For that matter, the total was more than for any non-WWF show in the US or Canada since possibly Dano O'Mahony vs. Ed Don George at Braves filed in Boston. And realistically that 45,000 figure would likely have been exaggerated. While WWE does routinely beat that number for modern shows at the time, aside from O'Mahony vs. George, in 1998 every other crowd of more than 38,000 legit in the US and Canada was headlined by Hogan. WCW never did another show with more fans, although the January 4, 1999 show at the Georgia Dome did a larger gate, $930,735, the show where Hogan won the title back from Kevin Nash in the infamous finger poke of doom. While one could argue that Jim Londos or Bruno Sammartino were bigger in their era and at least their key regions, because Hogan came at a time with more larger arenas and went all over the country, he drew far more crowds of 10,000 during the course of his career than any wrestler who ever lived. In 1984, he set the all-time record for most 10,000-plus crowds in a year in history. He broke that record in 1985 and again in 1986. While he never broke that record again, he was number one though 1991, the last year he worked mostly full-time, and in the later years, he cut back on dates to spend more time at home and took months off for movies and was still easily number one. But the Hogan era as the guy ended when, like Hogan did to Crusher in the Awa, a new goose came along who could lay bigger eggs in the form of Steve Austin. And just like Crusher's era was over, Hogan's as the main guy was over, even though he did have a nostalgia run in WWE where he was a key part of Stadium WrestleMania events. At that point, the best interest of Hogan and the best interest of WCW were no longer the same. Hogan never did a PPV rematch with Goldberg, which would have been one of the company's three biggest shows, if not the biggest, if it was done in late 1998 before the bottom dropped out. Most feel he totally sabotaged Bret Hart when Hart came out of WWF as the most talked about wrestler after being screwed and punching Vince McMahon. The fiasco that was the 2000 Bash at the Beach event showed that in Hogan, Bischoff and Vince Russo's infighting, that it had become all about ego and none had any real care about the audience they were supposed to be serving. WCW lost $62.3 million that year, the largest number for any wrestling company in history. Hogan never appeared for WCW after the show, suing Russo and WCW for breaching his creative control and defamation of character. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed, but Bischoff claimed Hogan did get a big payout from Turner later. In 1993 and again in 2001, Hogan and Jimmy Hart tried to round up people to start their own wrestling company. The first ended before it started as Hogan signed with WCW, leaving backers in the lurch. The same happened in 2001, where Hogan was going to be the face of the XWF, which Jimmy Hart would run. He started getting cold feet when the group started, but he did do a match with Curt Hennig, and immediately got an offer from WWF to return, which he took. Hogan returned as part of the heel NWO group, to lead to a big match at WrestleMania. Both Austin and The Rock were talked about as his opponent. Austin showed no interest in the match, although he would have been the first choice. Rock showed nothing but interest in it. And by coincidence, it was in Toronto. It was one of his most famous matches as the Skydome sellout crowd cheered Hogan at the top of their lungs, essentially forcing a babyface turn. McMahon changed plans to put the WWF title on Hogan on the next PPV, the April 21, 2022, Backlash show, where he beat Triple H. Technically he was the last ever WWF champion, as during his brief title run, WWF lost the lawsuit with the World Wildlife Fund, and the company changed its name to WWE. But nostalgia is what it was. Right after he won the title, his quarter hours were losing viewers. McMahon recognized it was over, and on May 19, at Judgment Day, he lost the title for the last time to Undertaker. During that period he had some of his last very good matches with Kurt Angle and Chris Jericho. He also put over Brock Lesnar clean on television on SmackDown with a shocking finish of Hogan passing out from a bear hug. Angle also beat him with an ankle lock, the only two times Hogan lost via submission in a WWF ring. Hogan lost to Lesnar and did an injury angle, with the idea of coming back for revenge on PPV. However, McMahon's idea was for Lesnar to beat Hogan again, and Hogan, who had creative control in his 2002 deal, decided to not return, and the company had to turn Big Show heel with Paul Heyman and make Lesnar a face in a panic reaction when Hogan didn't return. Hogan did another comeback as Mr. America, leading to a WrestleMania match with McMahon. In 2003, he made a deal with Jerry Jarrett, who gave him an early career break, to come to TNA. Jeff Jarrett hit him with guitar and an angle in Japan, but when they booked the grudge match, Hogan had a knee injury. Of course it was more than that, since he never ended up working for TNA at the time, and returned again to WWF for his last in-ring run. Hogan started a 2006 program with Shawn Michaels, which turned out to be a mess. Both didn't want to lose to the other. Michaels thought he was now the star, not Hogan. Hogan thought Michaels was nowhere near the star he was. Ultimately, one had creative control, so Hogan was going to win. Michaels oversold for Hogan in a complete comical fashion. While some thought his overselling was great work, most in wrestling found it totally unprofessional, including Hogan. The match drew a ridiculous 640,000 buys on PPV, a number that blew everyone away. Hogan got a $250,000 payoff, ridiculously small. Hogan came back in 2007 to do a SummerSlam match with Randy Orton, with the idea that Orton was hitting on Brooke Hogan. It made no sense for Hogan to win that match, especially since he suffered a very legit knee injury beforehand. The idea of him selling the knee and putting over Orton, to build for a rematch, was the only thing that made sense. Hogan had to win though, and that was his last match in WWF. There was at least talk of him doing a final match at the 2009 WrestleMania with John Cena, but it didn't happen. He did a 2009 tour of Australia with Ric Flair. Promoters had talked about starting an international promotion that would run all over the world and open up in China, where they claimed they had connections, using Flair and Hogan as the top stars. But the tour didn't draw well, and while they talked about doing more overseas, the promotion disappeared when the tour was over. Even at that stage of the game, Flair coming out of retirement was good enough to have Hogan's genuinely good match. Flair somehow found enough of what he had in the past, and he was the expert at working around limited performers, and Hogan could do at least a few of his trademark spots, once. But as was the case with so many of his matches, he'd do a match and then get injured and need surgery. The Australia tour drew poorly. A show in Brisbane only did 2,300 fans. Hogan, while in great pain and barely mobile, worked every main event with Flair, but the only way to get through those matches were tons of run-ins. In 2009, Hogan signed with TNA to start in 2010. Hogan insisted on Bischoff being brought in with him. TNA, through its deal with Spike, had finally broke even, and Dixie Carter and Spike wanted to challenge WWE on Monday nights, like they did in the Monday Night Wars. Hogan wanted to bring in his cronies, which the existing TNA fan base didn't like. While he was still a celebrity, he was now 55 years old, and as famous as he was, he couldn't carry a company in an authority figure role. He did one TV match in 2010, teaming with Abyss against Flair and AJ Styles, a PPV match with Sting in Philadelphia that did 30,000 buys, and 2 matches on a 2012 UK tour. His last match of his career was January 27, 2012, teaming with Sting and James Storm to beat Angle and Bully Ray and Bobby Roode. But overall this didn't work. Hogan was all over television as the main character, but it was as an authority figure. He worked there through 2013. The company was far worse off financially when he left than when he got there, and his leaving was almost ridiculous. A scenario that was so bad it was explained that he had creative control, and that was how he chose to go out. When the Bullet Club was at its hottest under Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks, he actually opened the door and wanted to join the group. He spoke with New Japan, but ultimately it never happened because he wanted too much money, and they felt for that much money he would have to do a match. In 2022 there were 2 surveys done that we got detailed results of. One scientific, asking people to name who they thought was the biggest wrestling star. The other by Houston Mitchell of the Los Angeles Times, which consisted of going to a mall and asking people to name a pro wrestler. In both surveys, Hogan greatly outdistanced The Rock as the name most mentioned. In the Mitchell survey it was almost 3-1. So many people became wrestling fans due to Hogan, almost surely more, as in far more, than any pro wrestler in any time frame. He was loved by many, certainly not the most beloved, that would likely be Santo, and certainly the most culturally revered, that would likely be Santo or Rikidozen. But he was culturally the best known in the US and Canada of anyone. You can argue Gorgeous George at his peak as a television star in the infancy was bigger for a very short period of time, but the reality is that George was 47 when he died in 1963, and the publicity of his death was comparatively so little that a few people were able to tour the country and claim they were the TV star Gorgeous George, and the media didn't even know better. Steve Austin was an incredible draw, and The Rock became one of the biggest movie stars in the world. But their peaks were much later than Hogan's, and even as of a few years ago, ask people to name a wrestler, and comparatively few would say Austin, Flair or Undertaker, and Cena was a very distant third, nowhere near second, and the majority would say Hogan. Music executive Mike Omansky, a longtime subscriber who saw almost every match Hogan had in Madison Square Garden, noted his interaction with Hogan in the music world. The one thing that I can advise on in detail is the Hulk Hogan record album, released in 1995, on Select Records. It was not wildly successful, but had some traction, and reached number 12 on the Billboard Children's Album chart. I had become friends with Jimmy Hart in 1987. As you know, Hart had a legit music background, the Gentrys in the 1960s, before he moved into wrestling. I had followed wrestling since childhood, and was in the music industry. Jimmy asked me to make a record deal for the album, which Hulk had wanted to do with him. It was Hulk Hogan and the Wrestling Boot Band, which consisted of Hogan, lead singer of course, Jimmy Hart, his wife at the time Linda, and J.J. Maguire. I made the deal with Select Records in NYC. While this was mostly a rap label, they successfully stepped out with non-rap, including the Jerky Boys. We announced the deal at a press conference at the New York Stock Exchange, which got a surprising pickup as newsworthy. I flew to major record sellers around the country with Hulk and Jimmy, including Best Buy, Tower Records, and Handelman, Rack Jobber, who served Kmart. We did a huge in-store at Tower Records, Sunset Boulevard, West Hollywood, California. Traffic was snarled up throughout the area, throngs of people turned out. Hulk, Jimmy, Linda, and JJ signed autographs. Hulk also did a satellite radio tour while out there, and we set him up at C100 in New York as well. In the end, it sold about 300,000 copies. His impact on the business cannot be overstated. So many people grew up as fans of his, many of whom became fans of others later. Still, the last image of him for most was of the 71-year-old Hogan carrying his t-shirt at the Republican convention, and doing a complete Hulk Hogan promo saying that the past and future president, Donald Trump, was his hero. This was not the pro wrestling crowd who knew too much and, surprising to him and many others, couldn't forgive a man who said he was a racist, used the N-word on a video that they heard and knew about, and just weren't going to let their childhood feelings look past that. And that was a shock to almost everyone. Of course, at the Republican convention, as long as you support Trump, all is good, and he got his last thunderous applause during a national spotlight. Even Tony Khan, who was publicly quiet about Hogan's passing, as were many in the industry, was brought into wrestling by Hogan. When Khan was 7, he was an avid television watcher, but did not grow up in a family what watched wrestling. But he saw Sergeant Slaughter every afternoon on the G.I. Joe cartoon, and saw Hogan on an episode of the A-Team. So, in him wanting to find out who those two people were, he discovered pro wrestling. While those two were his entrees and perhaps favorites at first, he very quickly moved on as his 4 favorite wrestlers were Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, Bret Hart, and Steve Austin. The industry lost a man today that redefined what success could look like in pro wrestling, said Nick Aldis on X. This post is to acknowledge Hulk Hogan's contributions to the industry, which are difficult to put into adequate words. Terry Bollea made personal choices that earned him understandable criticism, but I'm not here to weigh in on that. As someone who has put food on the table from pro wrestling for 20 years, I believe it is necessary to take a moment to recognize the importance of Hulk Hogan and Hulkamania to our business. He pulled the wagon and brought a ton of people with him. Brought wrestling into the cable TV era, changed the game for the way performers could monetize their talent. Put simply, he showed us what was possible. Also, he represents my childhood, and millions of others. That deserves recognition. Would never have been a wrestler if I didn't watch the Hulkster, said Matt Massey Jackson. Always so kind to me and my family. Made videos for my son that we'll cherish forever. So gracious, even when nobody was watching. WWE producer Shane Helms knew 2 sides of Hogan. I hate this shit, he wrote. I can't ignore the way Hulk made some of my friends feel. I also can't ignore the fact that he was incredibly good to me and was a part of the puzzle that is my life. The only thing I'm sure of is that hate is only defeated by love, not more hate. I wish everyone had the same experiences with Hulk that I did. I'm also aware that many didn't. I hate this shit. R.I.P. Hulk, may you find in your passing what you missed in your journey here. When I started in WCW, I had the pleasure of meeting one of my childhood heroes, then years later in WWE, I had a blast with him entertaining millions, wrote Chris Jericho. The same way he had entertained me for many years. Thank you for everything, Hulkster, you paved the way for all of us. Please say your prayers and eat your vitamins, everybody, you just never know. Georges St-Pierre, one of the all-time great MMA fighters, grew up as a wrestling fan of Hogan's, and seeing him in fights led St-Pierre on his own career journey. They say you should never meet your idols, but meeting Hulk Hogan made me admire him even more, said St-Pierre. He was so generous with his time and an inspiration not only as an athlete and entertainer, but also as a human being. He will be missed by us all. Flair and Hogan had a unique relationship. They were the 2 biggest stars of the 80s, but were never in the same place at the same time. Hogan was actually at one point in the program and thought to be at the first Starrcade in 1983, but there was never a chance of that happening since it coincided with the New Japan Tag Team Tournament. Flair never wrestled Sterling Golden in 1979 in Georgia. They worked on different sides in Japan, and when the game changed in 1984, they were the world champions for the two rival promotions in an era where the world championship meant so much more than today. In late 1991, after Flair was fired by Jim Hurt after a contract impasse without dropping the NWA title in the ring, the Hogan vs. Flair Dream program was done in WWF at all house shows. Flair was under the impression they were building up to a match at WrestleMania, where he would probably lose. They did DQ and count-out finishes at the house shows, and Hogan never beat Flair. In 1994, when Hogan came to WCW, he pinned Flair to win the unified WCW World and International titles in his first match. Flair was under the impression he would win a second match and then lose the third. But the second match ended with a DQ, and the third saw Hogan win. A loser must...